posteriori arguments are the kinds of arguments we use that derive from observation and experience. Okay, and that's going to be the cosmological argument. And by cosmos, we mean universe. And this is an argument from effect to cause and denial of an infinite regress. I'm sure you've heard of a version of the cosmological argument that since the universe began, something had to cause it, and that something is God. At its most basic level is the cosmological argument. These arguments try to show that from the fact that the universe exists, something must cause it, and God is that cause. So God exists. We also have the teleological argument, which is another a posteriori argument, and maybe you've heard of a form of this as well. Teleos means function, and this is usually an argument from analogy. And if you've heard of intelligent design, it usually is an argument that tries to make God's existence likely from the observed design of the universe. So typically you hear people make arguments like, if we look at the complexity of the human body, the human brain, the human eye, processes in nature, the complexity of the universe, somebody or something had to make it, right? There had to be a maker, just like we would look at a watch and say, this had to be made by someone or something. So the inference is that God is the cause of that design. And then we have a priori arguments, and these are arguments from reason alone. And this is the famous ontological argument. So ontos means meaning, and this is an argument from definition. It incorporates this notion that since we have ideas of perfection, and since we have an idea of necessity, that God's existence follows from that, that in order to talk about existence being perfect in some sense, there has to be something that embodies that existence, and that's God. So this would be an a priori argument for God's existence, because we're using reason alone to argue for God's existence. And then we have non-standard arguments for God's existence. Sometimes we use inference to the best explanation. This is the argument strategy where we assume that if something is the best explanation for some phenomenon, then it must exist. And we use this kind of reasoning all the time, right? So if you go out to your car and it doesn't start, what's the best explanation? Well, you probably left your lights on, right? Or you left the door open, or you're out of gas, right? You can make an inference to the best explanation as the cause, right? Also, many people make arguments for God's existence from religious experience, right? Arguments that the best explanation for phenomena like things such as miracles or near-death experiences is that there must be a God, right? So that's a pretty common, if not the most common, non-standard argument for God's existence. And then we have arguments against God's existence. One that we'll mention is the argument from evil, sometimes referred to as the problem of evil. Right? This is the argument in a nutshell that tries to show that since there is unnecessary evil, and a lot of it in the world that we have, whether it's children dying or a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering, that this is incompatible with the notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God. So therefore, God must not exist. This argument tries to show that God's existence is contradictory with the existence of, or incompatible with the existence of unnecessary evil. And then sometimes it can be inductive, which makes God's existence not completely ruled out, but unlikely given the amount of unnecessary evil in the world. Okay, so let's start with the teleological argument. As I said, we'll talk about the famous formulation by William Paley, and then famous objections from the Scottish philosopher David Hume. So William Paley was a well-known English theologian from the 18th century. He engaged directly with David Hume. Paley was very well known. Greatly influenced other philosophers, theologians, and scientists, including Darwin. And his famous argument is called the design argument, for good reason. You can see more about this argument in some of the media I post. Okay, so here's the general pattern of Paley's argument, right? So he uses a watch. Now, I know most of us probably don't even use watches these days because of our cell phones, but the analogy can still hold, right? If we look at a watch, what do we infer here? There's a lot of moving parts. It's very complex. It looks put together. So if we found this watch on the beach, what kind of inference could we make? Well, here we go. There's got to be a watchmaker, right? What happens when we look at the universe, when we look at the complexity of planets and natural life on Earth? Single-celled organisms are very complex. So it usually is an argument that says there are certain facts about the world, specifically that it exhibits purpose and order. Premise 2, the ordering of the universe must come from an intelligent designer. Just like we say that the purpose of this watch must come from a watchmaker, therefore there must be an intelligent designer to account for the observed order. So just like we infer that the watch had a watchmaker, we can infer that the universe had a universe maker, and that universe maker or designer is God. All right, so what are some objections? Well, famously, a lot of people think that this argument is weak because the analogy is weak. One, the universe does not necessarily exhibit that much order or purpose.